The first item here is to approve the agenda. Does anyone have any other additions? Seeing none, the agenda is approved. The next item is approval of the July 12th Audit Committee meetings. Can I get a motion to approve the meeting minutes? Okay, thank you. With the approval of the minutes,
Is there a second motion?
Oh, sir, that's right. Is there a second?
I second the motion.
Thank you. And, we'll vote on this one.
All those in favor?
Okay, all those in favor, say aye.
Aye. Aye.
All those opposed? All right, the motion passes. On to our first and only business item. We have a report of risk management and audit plan 2023. And Matt, go ahead.
All right, thank you, Chair Lee and members of the committee. I've been asked to remind all of you in the audience as well before I get started that there are cookies on the table. Compliments to Councilmember Vento, who is very appreciative if there are no more cookies at the end of the meeting.
They're not going home.
I also, just before I get started, I just want to note, I'm going to do as kind of a rapid fire version of this as I can. I know the weather is going to turn in a couple hours here, so I think I'm just going to try to get everybody out as soon as possible. So always available for questions and comments after the meeting as well. And as you'll find out, our audit planning is really, it has been evolving into almost an ongoing process. And I think we're even moving formally to adopting a plan that really is more of an ongoing, constantly evolving risk-based audit plan. So I guess first of all, I'm going to go through a brief a description of the process that we have for determining our audit plan. So it is risk-based, and it's developed with observations and experiences throughout the year, regular meetings with executive leadership and staff from around the council, and annual risk discussions with senior managers across the organization. I just remind the committee that this is one of the chartered responsibilities of this committee to approve this plan every year. So developed with primarily within the audit department, but is certainly within the purview of the committee to approve our work plan for becoming, we consider annually, but really on an ongoing basis. So as I mentioned, we had about 45 meetings with department leads around the council, including my interviews with executive level staff to gather feedback about potential risks and audit ideas around the council. We also employ what's called the CSAT tool, the Control System Assessment Tool, which is a requirement of state agencies that isn't required of us because we're not technically an executive branch state agency. However, the audit department feels like it's a good source of lens to put a risk assessment through, and it's a very typical control environment level assessment for organizations to do. So that's part of what we use to inform our plan. Before I get into the risks, I'll just mention that a draft of this risk assessment audit plan was provided to executive leadership and the committee members about 2 weeks ago for a comment, and had a little bit of feedback, but not too much. So I'm just going to go through very briefly the general risk environment. And Greg, you can move to the next slide. And just speak to some of the higher level points that we heard in our feedback, and I think have observed, and obviously a lot of you probably are aware of these in your own organizations as well. The first is, one of the foremost initiatives, equity at the council has been a big focus area for this council, and something that we've continued to focus on throughout the council and within our audit team. One note that I'll highlight that's in our audit plan that you'll see is our continued commitment to providing contracting opportunities to underutilized businesses. Something that continues to be something that we're working hard as a council to promote, and something that we're considering evaluation of in our audit plan to make sure that our programs around that initiative are going as they're intended to. Second, something that's always on all of our minds, the continued state of the economy. We're certainly not immune to those pressures at the council. Continued through last year and even into next year, feeling some of I'm going to say it, post-pandemic effects. Even though we're still technically in a pandemic, I think we're certainly moving into a new phase of this pandemic where we are all working at least some time in the office. We certainly are seeing other maladies taking over for COVID as being the primary driver of hospitalizations. But certainly effects are still there. And some of the effects that were acute during the pandemic are having lasting and echoing effects in the current market, including inflationary pressures, which as of yesterday sounds like it's starting to ebb a little bit, but still is certainly driving a lot of council activities, or affecting council activities. Global chip shortages, which affect everything from laptops, new vehicles. Increasing price of materials have affected council's large capital projects, repairs, and everyday purchasing. Revenue vehicle procurements are taking longer, have tighter schedules, in part because there are shortage of as with our Metropolitan vehicles, there's only one manufacturer. They're not making enough for everybody in the country to have full supply. Global oil prices are higher, but even since I wrote this sentence, the global prices have come down a little bit. So certainly economic pressures, but a sign that things are moving somewhat in the right direction, at least in some cases. Discussion of staffing, so recruiting, unemployment is at historic lows. In the job markets, as I was just discussing with Committee Member Rothler as she walked in, we're getting fewer applicants to our positions, we're having a harder time, certainly salary negotiations are challenging. But particularly impactful for the council are positions such as bus operators, information services, staff, and police officers. Those are three areas, but we're certainly feeling the effects all around the council. And we'll continue to probably for at least a short to medium term. It's had an impact on our business. We've had to, because of a shortage of operators, we've had to reduce trip frequency and the number of routes we've been servicing over the last several quarters. Major challenge for the council going forward. We're also experiencing higher turnover than we had last year. The mid-year staffing report stated that voluntary separations were 29% higher than the same point last year. So not only recruitment, but retention is an ongoing challenge, not just for us, but for all organizations, or most organizations. One area that popped up as a potential key risk area was asset management as well. Effective asset and lifecycle management is critical to any organization's success, particularly as capital-intensive an organization as we are. This was identified in several of our meetings this year, thinking everything from buses to IT equipment and just about everything in between. We have a number of new requirements from the FTA around asset management. And certainly it's important to maintaining the integrity of our systems, our software for cybersecurity. So you'll see that reflected in our audit plan as well, attention to that area. As I just mentioned, cybersecurity remains a top risk for council operations. We are a critical infrastructure service provider, both in transportation and in wastewater, and will remain a target for actors that wish to disrupt our critical infrastructure. And a new item this year was Governor Walz's executive order directing state agencies to implement cybersecurity measures to protect critical infrastructure. Again, as far as I understand, and Craig can actually speak, or Gretchen, although we're not a state agency, we're still planning on implementing as if we were, essentially. So they'll involve a number of key initiatives in the coming year. And just last but not least, state government. Governor Walz won re-election this year. However, for us, that still means that all of our council members are up for reappointment and our committee members. So we're actively going through that process now, and we look forward to the spring when we have new council and new committee seated. And the other thing I'll mention is news that the state surplus is running at $17 billion with a B, which is certainly good news and certainly could help address some of the coming long-term financial issues that we have in council. So that's what I have on that. Craig, if you could just forward to the next slide. I'll take a minute just to speak about the internal control environment. So this is based on our work on the CSAT tool, but I think also just really our team's work over the last 4 or 5 years and common issues that we're identifying. So one is around asset management, so creating and managing an asset inventory. Like I said, we have new requirements from the Federal Transit Administration, and we also have a wide enterprise with a lot of assets, a lot of different systems that maintain assets, a lot of different types of assets. And so there are initiatives to work on consolidating and updating systems and approaches to asset inventories across the council. 2, cross-training and single points of failure. We've had a couple findings about single points of failure. This is related to just having one person at the council that knows how to do a job, and what if they leave? We've actually had some examples of people leaving where, there was one person who had the password to something and they weren't around to help, find the password. So, and making sure that we're, especially in the employment environment that we're in, that we have cross-training, that we have duplication, redundancy across the council, making sure the controls are well documented and, again, redundant. Continue to develop strategic planning documents. We have Thrive 2040, which we're beginning the process as a council of updating for Thrive 2050. Still a ways to go on that process. But we have a strategic plan that was developed at the beginning of this council. That strategic plan goes through 2022, which is, have to do the math in my head, about 18 days from now. So this will be a key priority for the council to provide better clarity around our outcomes and our objectives, and how those tie back to our business processes across the council. So we can, especially those of us in regional administration, support the business objectives, that we can have clarity around what they are and how our work is improving those outcomes. Improve system security and training, the Data Practices Act. This is actually combining a couple different things, but cybersecurity is obviously a priority, as I mentioned. The Data Practices Act, I think, alludes to a broader issue, which is just ensuring that we have controls around the information we possess, which many times is not public and personally identifiable information. And continuing to develop those controls and awareness around the council to ensure that all staff understand their responsibilities and legal obligations under the Data Practices Act and other security-related standards. And then finally, identify, document, and communicate internal controls. I think that we have observed, and we're working on some ways to analyze our past recommendations, but to just put a really fine point on the easy one, document. I think every audit that we have, there's document policies and procedures, document the outcomes. And if you really think about, and my chief auditors in the room can certainly attest to this, the foundation of internal controls is having that documentation around the process, and then around evidence that we completed those internal controls. And tying that back to things like KPIs that lead to tell us how we're doing according to those outcomes. It's an area that we certainly have a lot of activities, control type activities at the council, but to say that we have that full layer of internal control, I think in some cases we pointed out is by those policies and procedures, an area that we need to improve on. Even our policies and procedures at the council, we have, I think, 80%, 75% that haven't been reviewed in the past 3 years. So we need to improve on that area to provide clarity around our sort of vision for how the council should be implementing its business objectives. All right, so next slide, please, Greg. All right, I actually just skipped this one. It's a nice view of the Twin Cities in the summertime, which seems like
Tease.
I'm gonna go through the details in different slides, but what I wanted to point out in this one is the different organizations. So one of the things I did this year was attend what's called Vision University. It's a chief audit executive training program, 4 days intensive out in Boston, is the cycle I went through. And one of the ideas that one of the CAEs had in the training was to do a plan this way, which is essentially the left-hand column starting to the left is ongoing work. So those are projects that we are actively in some phase. And so MnDOT and Job Class the reports are written, I just need to review them and get them reviewed by management. There's others like life cycle and change management, or life cycle management that we had entrance conference yesterday. We're still early in grants management, we're still in planning. But those are work that are ongoing. The 6-month plan is what we anticipate, given existing staffing and resources, that we should be able to at least start within the next 6 months. So that's kind of that next list up in the queue, things that we think are priority items. So think by, May of next year, we should be able to at least get started. The 12 to 18 month plan becomes a little more flexible. Those are ideas that we've heard in risk assessment that sounded like, yeah, they might be interesting or they might be of value. One like the North Star, we do that every year, but we usually don't start until November, so it's on there, but we'll do it, but other areas, we have a sense, like eBuilder, we have a sense that, well, that's a pretty critical system for our capital projects, we should really get to that, when we have resources and time. So we're putting a list together of things that we think are out there, but we don't necessarily have the staff to immediately respond to it. And then the special projects column are other activities that we're doing. So things like follow-up, we're working on ethics and compliance improvement, et cetera. So the idea is that we'd probably bring this plan back in 6 months. In theory, we'd have all the ongoing audits would be taken care of. The 6-month plan would be more of the ongoing list. And the 12 to 18 month, we'd select audit work for the next plan. So Greg, if you can move to the next slide. So like I mentioned, these are the 6 that we have ongoing right now. One note that I want to make sure is clear, as far as for the audit plan, I've put a contract administration, we've had this on the audit plan, we've also had other things. Contract administration, the way we're going to handle this going forward is that it's an umbrella that includes a lot of different activities. So we've already reviewed actually 20 contracts, I think, that we've sampled across the council. We've got a selection, there'll be just IT contracts. And then we've got a lot of work on capital projects, including Southwest Light Rail, including Gold Line, that will fit under this bucket. What you'll likely see, or the committee will likely see, would be a meeting probably in June where we'd come and we'd summarize all of this activity, because we don't need to bring every single audit of a contract to the committee, but I think it's worth both for you as members, but also for procurement staff, finance staff, to get that collective feedback, that here's some observations we saw across 15 contracts, and so we can address those more holistically. And then each contract might have some acute things like, it says you're supposed to get this delivered, we'll get the deliverable. So, Councilmember Vento.
Thank you. Chair Lee and I both live in districts that overlap with both the Gold Line and what will be Purple Line. Not sure what it'll be yet, but how soon does the audit of a contract of one of those transit systems begin? How early in their process? You mentioned Gold Line, so I'm curious as to.
Yeah, Councilmember Vento, members of the committee, it really varies, and part of this is the challenge of having so many ongoing projects.
Yeah.
We spent a lot of time on Southwest, as you can imagine. And so I just be honest that to the detriment probably of other projects, because it's taken, as you know, and as the council's time, a lot of energy and effort to make sure that we're focused on that project. We did start our first, we've met with that project office several times.
The Gold Line? The
Gold Line, and we actually have met with just about all the project offices. We do that as part of risk assessment, and even do it just on as periodically to understand what's going on. This is the first audit of a contract, so we've chosen their architectural and engineering contract. Certainly we have a lot of lessons learned from Southwest and other projects that we can apply, so that's the lens we're taking with that one. And I anticipate that'll be one that we'll have complete sometime early in Q1, Q2.
Thank you.
Okay. I guess I can ask, is there any other questions? So this is just, I mentioned a couple of these, job class and MINDEC grants are both very close to completion. Probably another week or two we'll be finished with those. The others, we're still kind of in some sort of process development planning.
Any other questions or comments from Matt?
I have another one.
Councilmembers.
My siblings sometimes give me the middle name doom and gloom, but in the last few months between the water issue in Mississippi and the attack on the electrical grid in North Carolina, I find myself sometimes either going to bed thinking about it or waking up in the morning thinking about what kind of an impact some sort of a crisis here within the Met Council might have, and how much everybody thinks about that. I don't want to ruin people's days, but When something like what happened in North Carolina happens, do alarm bells go off here, and do we feel like we're prepared for some sort of a crazy and unpredictable?
Yeah, Chair, Councilmember Vento, members of the committee and staff. Yes, I think that's obviously true. And I'll say that our level of maturity, as you know, we had a presentation in June, I think, about cybersecurity, Gretchen White, our CISO. And I think that our maturity level in terms of how we're responding and preparing to respond for those types of potential attacks has really improved over the last couple of years. I certainly share your concern and your thoughts about that issue in particular. I think it'd be appropriate to come back, have Gretchen come back and talk more about, I think we've planned on that happening at least once or twice a year. And definitely something we should think about for maybe the next meeting to have another discussion about our progress, because we have a Gretchen will correct me if I'm wrong, but IT Audit Labs resource that we have now that has been engaged with the risk assessment, IT risk assessment, and continues to identify and help mitigate those threats.
Mr. Chair, if I could just, I want to comment on the university sewer system issue that occurred several times this summer, and I want to acknowledge, I don't think she's still here, but Terry Dreesen and the environmental services staff, and what a great job they did handling that unforeseen situation, and they were a part of a team effort in addressing it, but I just want to note how important that communications piece is with it too. You know, it's, I think what people in the community get frustrated with during a crisis is not knowing what's going on and why and when's it going to be resolved.
Sure.
Thanks.
And Councilmember Bento and members of the committee, it highlights, I think, the issues you raise, highlight the challenge of putting together a plan.
Yeah.
Because it's just, we are a very risk-rich environment, and you know, we're only a few people, and so we're certainly doing our best, and that's why we appreciate the feedback. Why we reach out so much to try to get feedback to identify what we can potentially audit and improve some value added to the community. So, all right, Greg, if you want to slide to the next slide, I'll just highlight a couple of these. So, or talk a little more about what they are. So, I mentioned the underutilized businesses program. That's an area that we plan to focus on. Still haven't scoped exactly what that looks like, and I know there's some potential work from the outside on that program as well. So we're always coordinating with other outside entities to ensure that we're not doing exactly the same thing. We can maybe do something here and we'll work on that side. So we'll find more about that when we get into it in the spring. Fuel management is controls around. It's an area we haven't audited before, but our fuel program. And we actually have fuel tanks that people can use for our fleet vehicles, whether that be managed appropriately. As you may or may not know, there's a new, there's a new garage opening in the North Loop, but you may not notice there's a cash room that will be included as part of that move. So we'll be moving from one cash room to a new cash room. So we'll have some work done, probably pretty discrete work around the move and controls around that movement. Bank account reconciliation, this is something, there's an asterisk there because what I'm planning to do is have a third party look at our bank accounts. And so we haven't gotten that contract yet, we're still working on that, but something we'll plan to do. Something that's come up before in external audit work. Police asset evidence and asset inventory, that's pretty routine for us. We've done that most years, but it's just going in and making sure that they have controls around their assets. And evidence blockers. Stock rooms, we've always had some role in stock rooms. It's kind of varied, but we're thinking about how we can approach that in the lens. One of the things we're thinking about there is that we have stock rooms, but we have a ton of other assets, and is there ways we can expand our work on just stock rooms and focus on everything? Because the stock rooms is just one very small part of what we want to control. Body-worn cameras, there was an external audit done to meet the state statute this fall, but we still have body-worn cameras on our agenda. I think, fortunately, to some extent, we haven't had a major incident yet where we've needed to maintain video by state law. So that was we passed the test because we never had come across that situation before. But I think we as an audit team would like to have a crack at looking at the controls around body-worn cameras and sort of going through those potential questions. Accounts payable process, we touched the accounts payable process in a lot of different ways through our contract audits. You'll hear a bit about the vendor file audit we just completed. We still think there's some areas in the accounts payable that we can focus on. We're gonna think about where our best value is gonna be for looking at that process. IDASH is a system that Metro Transit developed with the help of the IT department to handle a lot of information about bus drivers and other employees, and one of the things we'll focus on is controls around, as I mentioned before, about personally identifiable information and data access. And recruiting and hiring, it's I don't have anything specific targeted here, but you mentioned it's a risk, and so it's something we're always kind of thinking about whether there's a value add we can do with the recruiting and hiring process. So that one's still, that one I think will be probably second quarter to start if we can get there. And we'll have to think about what, if there's where we can target our work there to be the best of help. Greg, the next slide. So some things that came up as kind of on the outside. Risk management process review, so thinking about controls around this. This kind of came out of our vendor file work and how risk management creates vendors. But there's a lot of other controls that might be worth looking at. Working with Phil Walljasper about some of the areas we might want to look at. Make sure things are documented, that we can find documentation, that sort of thing. The North Star work is work we do every year. It's pretty routine. Metro Transit customer complaint response. I don't think there's any specific concern there, but it's just something that it's a really important process, and so we haven't looked at it in a while. So we thought that would be something that we'd consider. Maybe ask some additional questions and do some risk assessment before we commit fully. But cloud computing, we're moving significantly to the cloud, so it's an idea of a potential audit that how we're handling those contracts and controls around cloud computing. But again, not fully developed yet. eBuilder is our system for managing our contracts, where a lot of our business processes around the project offices, and ensuring that those controls for access and audit trails and everything else are there. And then HRA payments review is another that we just haven't, nothing in particular, just haven't been there in a while. So something we're considering. And then just before I take questions, I'll go to the next slide, Greg. I think I have one more here. These are just some other projects and follow up, which I'll talk a little bit about in the director's report, ethics compliance improvement, which is our ethics point system, and we've got a whole project around that, reporting of complaints and other things. Enterprise risk implementation, which Phil is not here today, so I will do a little bit of presentation at the end about enterprise risk. External audit coordination, which I really, really hope is less than it was this year, because it was a significant effort this year, as you probably know. Audit strategic plan implementation, where Julie Quell, our manager, has a project around designing a way to implement our strategic plan and provide, it's actually a lot of things we're already doing, but some formal efforts there. Indirect cost rates, which we do every year. Transit ridership is something that we're working on right now. They're thinking about moving to APCs as their primary method of collecting data. So we're kind of reviewing some work there, and then always investigative work if something's needed. So I think that's all I have. Any questions for me?
Any questions or comments from Matt? Councilmember Barber.
Mr. Chair, thank you. A couple of questions. So the first one on the Metro Transit cash remove. So first one, is that happening? And then are you guys part of the planning process ahead of that happening, or just checking afterwards?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, Councilmember Barber. Yeah, so we talked to the cash room, the cash folks quite a bit anyway. Yeah, we'll talk to them about what we want to document ahead of the move in terms of just what are all the things that we're supposed to be moving from A to B, how are we doing it, and then we can do some validation on the back end. It's something we actually did the same thing when the police department moved, and done similar things in the past. So it's just it's kind of listed as an audit. It's kind of a bit consulting too. It's just here's some things you might want to think about when you move, and what you thought about, take a picture. So.
Yeah, very good, and it's such a much better space. It's they were in a very much a hole in the wall kind of type.
It's hard to get worse than it was.
Much improved. And then body worn cameras, so you said, you had the state audit, is it, your audit looking at how the data is stored in the security, or is it who's turning them on or transfer, like what is the scope of that?
Yeah, I just responded to that one. We've reviewed the audit that came in from, it was a third-party vendor to meet the state statute. There was no exceptions in that audit. We're meeting all the basic requirements. I think what we'd like to do is get it a little more detail with some of the, as you mentioned, I mean, almost exactly what you said, the contracts, doing a little bit more validation on a regular basis, not waiting every 2 years to do, are they turning them on? So we've always thought that there'd be this statutory requirement outside and that internal audit come in between with spot checks to make sure that we're continuing to, keep up with the standards. So.
And if Mr. Chair, if you don't mind, and I would offer that would be great for the full council to hear. That's a policy that we put in place, was a body worn camera policy, and I think we'd like to get a good idea of how it's working. And then I have a final one, a question, just a comment. I'm really glad to hear you're going to do some auditing of the Metro Transit's customer complaint response. I think that's one of those very public things that you people see, people comment on. My perception is we generally do pretty well, but I would like to know if that's the case. And so I think it's be very helpful for us as council members to see that. It's probably the area of things we hear about the most, right? Yeah. So, thank you.
Committee Member Galsworth?
Yeah, thank you, Julie. I have I have a few questions. Let's try to group them here together. So on staffing, so your department's staffing right now. So I'm wondering where are you currently at from a staffing perspective, and are there any particular roles in which that you're struggling to fill, for specific skills that's preventing certain audits? And then I want to tie that with that co-sourcing comment. Is that what's driving this co-sourcing, or is that always intended to be a co-source, or when have you used co-sourcing in the past?
Committee Member Galswick. It's a good question. So we are, for 2023, our allotment is 12 FTEs. Doing the math in my head, we currently have 10 or 11. We have 2 positions open. They're analyst in charge roles. So I would say that we've had probably similar challenges to what other organizations I think have had in terms of recruiting talent. I mean, we've just had, I would say over time, in my experience, we've had fewer and fewer applications for the positions we've advertised for. And talking to my colleagues at Vision University, I would say that every single audit department in the country is struggling to find professional qualified IT auditors, as you probably are aware.
Yeah, I would echo that.
Yeah. The idea behind the co-sourcing is, in part, I think that what we don't have in-house is any specific qualifications around kind of forensic accounting and that detailed level of review. And I think just generally, the idea of starting to co-source some of our work is a bit of a hedge against potential future recruitment challenges. I think it's important to think about, it's not putting all of our eggs in one basket, ensuring that we can, if we need to pivot to something else for any number of reasons, whether it be an increased volume of audit work requests, significant fraud circumstances that might come up, or we suspect that we'd have those resources available. And so part of that is dipping the toe into the co-sourcing pool as a way of making sure that we have a full suite of options for approaching all sorts of audit challenges.
So this is a new space you're moving into with the co-sourcing?
We have used, we certainly co-source for investigative work. And we have co-sourced for cyber related investigations before and we did that through our risk management, our cyber insurance. And so to some extent that was a successful model and one that I think we can build on. So it's certainly not our first experience, but I don't think we've ever approached an audit plan and said, here's something that we think we're going to co-source. So it's a bit new. But I appreciate you bringing that up.
So another question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I have a couple of scoping questions, but I'll talk to you about that offline. But question for you here on the audit follow-up. So I know that you've been developing a system trying to manage the follow-up process and your results. Are you currently doing follow-up on all issues that are outstanding, and how much time do you expect that to really take? Or is that a major time commitment, or et cetera, or is it going to be something that is kind of side work that you're kind of continuously doing?
Yeah, committee work also, it's a combination of both. I mean, so there's some that I think are issues that you'll hear me talk about this a little bit in this meeting even. Some of the issues that you'll see, we'll bring to committee frankly, things like fare evasion, that we have some recommendations that are now about 2 years plus old that we'd like to just bring back, and we'll engage with Metro Transit, because I know there's activities going on around fare evasion. There's a lot of since we issued that report, we've had a pandemic, and our ridership is at 60% or whatever it is, what it was. So it's a different universe, and so it's probably less important to draw that specific line on the recommendation, but like where are we now with that issue? So that'll be a bit of a project. There's others that you'll hear about this in some of the reports we're issuing today, where we, in our reports we'll say we're going to follow up through just confirming that something like the procedure has been written. We'll check that box. In other cases, we're going to retest it because we're that concerned that this is an issue that has been lingering. And you'll see one of those in our report today, that our user administration and terming employees has been an issue for 7 years here. And so we're not just going to check the box that somebody wrote a procedure. We're going to retest that. So we'll actually plan for that in the coming year. And so it depends a little bit on what the issue is. And I'll talk a little bit about kind of issue by issue what we have for follow-up in my director's report.
So just
Hopefully
to clarify, make sure I'm understanding it, the follow-up, you're going to decide it by issue essentially, if you'll do any follow-up, if you'll do policy kind of level confirmation, or if you'll do testing.
Confirmation, retest, or there's another category I just call risk assess, which is, this is like almost anything else. I mean, we have to, we're not just gonna always focus on the same issue, but it's supposed to be put into context of everything else we're concerned about the council. We're gonna avoid cybersecurity because we have a AP follow-up, right? So.
Yep. Okay. Thank you.
Member Jorgensen.
Thank you, Charlie. Mr. LaTour, so in your information here about general risk environment, you particularly point out asset management, and that's something that's repeatedly mentioned. And so I see, maybe one, possibly two items that relate to that in your next 6 months, but really nothing in long term. So can you just speak to that a little bit about how you're going to address that? And then could you also remind the committee if there are federal audit activities around asset management that supplement the work that you do?
Yeah, Committee Jorgensen. So to address the former question, the FTA does have a asset management requirement. They do have that as a section of their triennial program. The way that the triennial works is that the first time it's an agenda item, it's a very thin, like, can you pass a test by showing me something that says asset management on it? I mean, I'm paraphrasing, and it's more in depth than that, but it is, to your point, something that is part of the federal review process going forward, for sure. To address the second, we actually had a really interesting conversation about life cycle management yesterday, where I think what we'll probably consider that as almost to be ongoing work. There are, in the meeting, we probably came up with 10 items we could focus on: laptops, servers, software, just in the IT space. So I think and to the point of the stock room being kind of an ongoing, we used to do that just cyclically, kind of show up every 3 years at every stock room, and we've tried to get away from that because we think it's fairly predictable that, hey, guess what, we're showing up in Reuter this year, so guess where you're going to focus. So I think both of those is really, and I think the life cycle management you'll see in the next year we haven't decided exactly what approach will be, but thinking about, well, maybe we'll take a couple pieces of this, report on it, then come back and do a couple other pieces using a same audit program, so we get that consistency and cadence that we're just on this consistently. So hopefully that answers your question.
Committee Member Brown.
Just a general comment first, as I told Matt earlier, I really appreciate the risk assessment, and I can appreciate the amount of work that goes into developing this. It's especially helpful, I think, for myself as a public member to get a sense of, kind of what's going on in this organization. So kudos to you and your staff for that. I also really liked the way that you described asset management and how it does actually relate very much to cybersecurity also. Key control from a cybersecurity perspective is to know what you have in order to know what you need to protect. And then kind of a follow-up to committee member Bento's comments about disaster recovery, business continuity. In general, has internal audit taken a look at the status and the currency of the overall business continuity plans and disaster recovery plans of the council?
Committee member Rother, yes, you know, we do that through risk assessment. We do have a group department that has business continuity as focus. To be perfectly honest, that area has been pretty consumed with pandemic-related activities for the past couple of years. So, but it's a good reminder that we probably do need to circle back, and maybe something we should think about adding for the distant plan, because we haven't. It's an interesting thing to add, I think, maybe for that outlook. So we'll consider that as a potential add, or maybe at the next meeting we can you know, circle back with that group and see if there's some things, because there's no doubt that we could definitely, it's an area of emphasis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to follow on that, I can tell you, looking back years ago and looking at our continuity of operations plan and all of that, and then to see it go into play and get really tested with the pandemic response it was actually quite impressive. It was very good. You know, you can make all these documents and prep and plan, and then it goes and sits on a shelf, but it was clear that this was developed for action. And I was really impressed with how quickly they stood up the operations and the response. One of the things we've talked about management committee is now we need to look back and see if we missed anything, if we change anything, you know, what else needs to be added. But
Cool, thank you.
Committee member Rother, CISO White just reminded me that they are doing that as part of an assessment too, as part of the IT audit labs work.
Oh.
The disaster recovery and ensuring that the capabilities we think we have, we do have.
So another element to, like, before I head to the audit plan, I'll probably confer and make sure, because that reminded, that's one of the reasons why we probably don't have it, because we always are considering what else is going on in terms of other audit work and insurance providers, so.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? All right, with that, I will now entertain a motion to approve this business item.
So
Second.
Thank you. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Motion passes. Next, we have 3 reports, and the first report is the director's report and the annual report, and once again, Matt has the floor.
All right, Mr. Chair, members of the committee, you get to hear from me for a little while longer. This is always my hardest meeting of the year, because I talk for like basically 45 minutes straight. Not used to doing that. I think there's a presentation here, but I'll just get started. Craig, if you want to bring up the audit. We don't have one, okay. I'll just speak to it, and I think you have copies in your packet. So first, I'm gonna kind of lump the director's report and the annual audit plan together. So first there's a department update. I think since our last meeting, Nick Jelinek was promoted to our second manager position. And you know, I should just mention he's quickly distinguished himself in his 5 years with the council. And we're very happy, and I think he's doing a great job in terms of his work as a manager. It's allowed us to kind of align a little better as a department around, you know, I think, you know, my job has been very outward facing while trying to manage the internal part of the department, and this, I think, is providing a better balance where I can continue to do some of the activities I'm doing with external audits and planning chief and executive work, and Nick and Julia can manage the projects. I think it's going to be, it has been and will be a very great model for us going forward, and we're working right now on sort of rebalancing roles, responsibilities, and doing some resetting around the beginning of the year with how our process works and who does what. So, but we're very happy about that development. Also mentioned that Christina Luna joined us as an intern. Anna Greenstein moved on to a different opportunity, and as we've done actually once or twice in the past, there's sometimes we have students that take a different summer opportunity and they're available again in the fall. So Christina's been doing a great job working with Kevin Ely on some of our IT projects. As I mentioned, we have two current open positions for AIC. We're hoping to fill those in early 2023, and at that point, we'd consider ourselves fully staffed. So I think, again, like the org chart will look like it's supposed to, and finally kind of be in a place where, after 4 years of kind of building, that we should be in a really good place moving forward. Just to highlight two significant external audits that are still going on. The first, the Office of Legislative Auditor, it's been widely publicly reported that this audit is happening. I'm in the role of coordinating a lot of the activities between the OLA and our staff at the Southwest Project Office and around the council, because it's frankly been, it's human resources, finance, everything. The volume of work is pretty exceptional. I mean, it's been a lot of documentation provided to the OLA, as you might expect. And as again, this has been, I think, reported publicly that they are anticipating a report in February related to, I understand it to be a special review similar to what they issued in the fall, that will be about the construction phase of the project. And then a second, they'll be more evaluative on change orders and nonconformist reports. In April is the anticipated deadline there. So work continues, and we'll look forward to hearing the results of that work in the spring. The only other thing we have going on right now is the indirect cost rate review from MnDOT. That hasn't been very intensive. It's just them looking at how we calculate our indirect cost rate and apply it to federal contracts that are passed through from MnDOT. It's routine. It's something they do with all their subrecipients, so it hasn't been a high volume, but there's potential that could affect some of our processing internally. I'm gonna skip the audit plan completion for a second and get to that. And I have talked about ongoing projects already, so I'm gonna skip that. I think I will talk a little bit about the follow-up at this point. So I included the table out of the database that highlights the number of audits we have with follow-up, total recommendations, and continuing open recommendations. So as you can see, 2020 is mostly complete. I believe payroll is the only thing outstanding, and then we have also have the fair evasion work that I mentioned from 2020 that we need to still address in early 2023. I'll just mention some other, you can see the data in terms of numbers. Some of the areas that still have outstanding recommendations. We have IT asset management that we we issued in 2021. We've got Metro Transit facility security. We've closed a lot of the regional parks findings, but we still have, I believe, one open. And then we have our LASSO report that we finished this year that I know we're pretty close to being able to, I think, Joe gives me a thumbs up, close out some of the recommendations on that report. So I anticipate that a couple of these will actually, potentially have pretty significant discussions in this committee about, whether we're going to close those as implemented or not implemented, and have a discussion of risk acceptance on some of the areas. So more to come there. Any questions about follow-up before I move on?
Yeah, Chair Lee?
Yeah, go ahead.
Matt, I'm curious to know, is there a process in place for risk acceptance regarding your recommendations?
Committee member Rother, we've never actually done that in this committee before. So that is something that, as we've kind of developed this database and the feedback from this committee about follow-up, that's what I'm alluding to is making sure that we have a process to ensure that all the stakeholders are here, and we've sort of talked through, because it isn't necessarily risk acceptance. It's just understanding what the tolerances are and what activities are going on. So we have to, as I mentioned with fair evasion specifically, we have to evaluate that report again in context of the pandemic and everything that's changed and all the activities going on. So I think that's one where it's probably worth just having a discussion with the committee.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments?
Yes, I have one comment on it. Just kind of thinking about it. So I think that makes a lot of sense to me to go back and look at it and say, has the inherent risk changed? There could be a situation where this is no longer an issue, or some of these items might no longer be issues that really would be report level, even if they still are there. But to community member Rothler's comment, I think having a process to be able to accept risk is also really important, where there might be a situation where everybody agrees that this is a problem, but, or maybe you believe that it's more of a problem than management does, and I think that healthy disagreements can happen and they can raise that to the committee and say, we want to accept that. So it might be something to be thinking about doing, especially as more pressure gets put on the follow-up, that you really are going to confirm that they're remediating this.
Yeah, and members of the committee, I should also just highlight here, because it's really relevant to this discussion. The last item that we won't be able to do today, because Phil is still recovering from something, he said it's not COVID, it's something, is he's going to present on enterprise risk management. And what I think the reason why we haven't really had a risk acceptance process here is because we don't really have a formalized enterprise risk management process at the council. And so for us to come up with something is whatever we kind of think, right? Having an enterprise risk management process in place sets up the framework that will allow us to have those discussions. And we'll have a more formalized risk register. This is what our risk tolerance is in this area. So when we audit, we already know all of these things ahead of time, and we can actually have a more framed discussion. And when recommendations are not implemented, it's clearer, I think, as an organization what the risk is, and not just audit saying, well, we think it's high, right? So I'm tap dancing a little bit on that because that project isn't running yet and hasn't been implemented, but I think that will frame our discussions here. And I think the anticipation is that project will report to many committees, but also to the audit committee on a regular basis. So more to come on that, and I'll speak to it a little bit at the end, if I still have a voice left.
Councilmember Barton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think that's a great point. So my other side of my world, I work in the medical device industry, and everything is based off of risk management. And it's almost to at the end of things, you do almost a risk benefit analysis, and then you determine, you may still have inherent risk, but it's acceptable that you've mitigated it as much as we're comfortable, that we think we're okay with it. And actually going through that process really makes you think through the steps, and you know what could go wrong and you know why. And I think that's a good process to kind of build into some of our conversations.
Thank you. Any other comments, questions from me? Thanks, Smith.
I just have a couple other things on so I'm gonna just pivot entirely to the annual plan, and I just have a few more remarks to make, and I'll probably cut off some of it because I know I've already talked too much, but I just want to highlight we've got our audit accomplishments, and you'll see the activities and we have it relative to 2021. As I've talked to my team a lot in the last couple months, well, a couple weeks as we've been doing performance evaluations, and tell you a lot to Mary Bogey and others about, we on the surface we only had 3 audits completed this year versus 10 last year. And I just want to address that, to some extent, it feels like, boy, shouldn't we have accomplished more? I think the context of that is a couple things. One, the level of external audit work we completed this year was coordinated, especially the triennial, which involves almost all of my staff for really 2 or 3 months, is significant, and really, at the beginning of the year, kind of sidelined a lot of things, picked it up. We have a couple things that are really close to being done, so it's kind of not an accurate reflection entirely of the work we completed. I think it's worth pointing out, and you'll hear later, that some of the audits we did complete were very, very long quality pieces of work, and as I've talked to some of the senior leadership here, we'd rather have quality over just a bunch of quantity. So certainly worth addressing there. But especially now, as I alluded to, with 2 managers in place and having our audit process that we've been living with, and I think we're going to really focus on in January, early January, trying to get rid of some of the pain points that end up adding time and volume to audits that we maybe don't need, or we can be more efficient in our activities. There's always room for improvement. So I think that there's kind of this a level of extenuating circumstance. The other thing that I'll mention is just the control environment issues that we talked about. It is a challenge for us whenever we start an audit and we go in and there isn't policies and procedures written, because the auditors in the room know that that's what you're basically there to evaluate. So if you can't find the policy and procedure, you can't find where the documentation is located, it creates a really challenging environment to audit in. And we certainly have some improvements that we're working on in terms of systems and data accessibility. I don't think we have problems here with people not wanting to share things with the audit staff. I think it's just an accessibility issue. And sometimes it's the way things are organized. So that creates challenges for us as well. So just wanted to put context around that. It's certainly not meant to be a list of excuses or anything like that. I think we did a lot of good work this year, as you'll see in a minute, as we reported on a couple of our audits. But and the other thing is we had 3 pretty significant investigations we worked on this year. Co-source those, but it still takes a lot of effort from our staff to do the intake and review reports and set up meetings and things like that. So, and a number of other areas that we get questions, we help work on issues, we do research. So proud of the accomplishments of the team this year, but certainly we'll look at that, sort of how much quality audit work are we producing as a goal for next year. So that's pretty much all I have. I guess I'll stand for any additional questions, otherwise we can.
All right, any final, go ahead, Committee Member Cosmo?
Yeah, just one final comment or question on that last item related to the audit plan completion. Something that might be helpful or to consider for next year's report would be if you have these major buckets of investigations and external audit support in your internal audit plan, even just seeing like what percentages were you expecting your staff to spend time on A versus B versus C versus what ended up happening. So if you plan for 20% time on investigations and if it's 55, then it becomes a lot easier to follow, kind of what shifted there.
Members of the committee, I'm actually glad you brought that up, Committee Member Galswick. One of the things we implemented in June of this year was we did our time and it was always just coded as audit time. We have project-based codes now. We've been working with those for about 6 months, so I'm not really ready to produce results because we didn't have everything coded, but going into next year, we will have every line item. So we will be able to show that, like exactly how much time me and everybody else in the audit staff spent on something like the triennial investigative work, or each specific audit, so we can track better, target, hey, we plan on spending 50 hours on this, not much more than that, and then look at it at the end and, hey, we spent 75. Well, can we look and try to identify and biopsy why we spent 25% more or 50% more time than we expected? So I anticipate by this time next year we should have a much better able to report out, and actually for my own clarity, like what we really are spending our time on. So
Even at this committee level, even if it's just large buckets, it helps give us an idea of, okay, what really happened, investigations blew up, or, external audit support blew up. So,
right.
Perfect, thank you.
Any other comments or questions? All right, thanks, Matt. Next we have a vendor file management presentation by Nicholas Jelinek and Timothy Larson.
Okay, so Nick and I will be covering briefly the audit work that we did for vendor file management. But first we wanted to do a little bit of context on what a vendor is and what a vendor file, how it's being used around the council. So for procurement, a vendor is the kind of traditional things or entities such as contractors, suppliers, governments, other professional organizations. In HRA, a vendor is landlords, tenants, and other housing authorities, and then in risk, it's lawyers, insurance companies, and even employees. And this is just a condensed, abbreviated version of kind of the process of how a new vendor, new vendor file is created, or a request comes in for a change. So that request will come in, there's documentation that comes in with it. It's essentially a little bit of a background check, and then that information is put into PeopleSoft. And then in some instances, some of these ancillary systems such as WAM and TXBase will pull some of the information out of PeopleSoft with some additional manual data entry as well. So for this audit, there were 4 objectives. The first was to simply assess the vendor file accuracy. Second was to identify if there were any duplicate vendor files in our systems. And then we wanted to determine if any maintenance activities were being performed. And then finally, we wanted to identify if any best practices were being implemented. We won't hit all the observations. We want to point out the more salient ones, I guess you want to say. The first is that the process is duplicated across the 3 departments that I mentioned, or was in the previous slide, so HRA, risk, and procurement, with slight little variations in each process with some of the documentation. Next, so a little over 5% of the vendor files had not been used in over 5 years, so the maintenance issue. Do want to point out that there was one group that had just, as we were conducting the interviews in the audit, one group had just finished up cleaning up their vendor files, another group was just starting, and then another group, the last group, hadn't done any maintenance on it in quite some time due to resource constraints. And then we did find duplicate vendor files in our system as well as some data quality issues. On the duplicate vendor files, a large majority of these, if I remember correctly, were due to us intentionally creating duplicate vendor files, or creating duplicates intentionally. That has to do with the system limitations with PeopleSoft and some of these the ancillary systems that we have with WAM and TXBase. The data quality issues, those are anything ranging from name convention issues, so when to use abbreviations versus when to spell it out, when to use an ampersand, or type out and. Missing tax identification numbers, a tax identification number might be just a string of 9s. There's some also missing contact information, addresses.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, one of the next findings here is that vendor information change requests are not systematically verified. So if I want to go in as a contractor, or I want to update who the primary point of contact is, or I need to update my phone number, we do not have a singular method for verifying these across the 3 departments. So the question is, how do I verify that I am Bob of Bob Vance's Refrigeration? So how do I make sure that that is actually Bob? So we would like to see some improvements made there. The next one here is that we were not checking for conflicts of interest. And we found some potential conflicts of interest while we were reviewing the vendor file, and we referred those to management. And then finally, we had some private and confidential data that was available within internal systems. And I believe we have made steps to rectify that issue. So the overall conclusions here are that this is an inefficient, error-prone process, and that's partially due to, or mostly due to having 3 different processes feeding back into our financial system. However, with that said, there are many opportunities to implement consistent best practices, improve our system of internal controls, improve our documentation, and I know management has really taken to that piece of it so far. As we go on here, we use better and additional controls will help reduce the fraud risks, as the purpose of the vendor file is, this is the first point for anybody to actually get paid when they do business with the council. By helping, then the next point here, by helping reduce the duplicative process, there's potentials to increase efficiency, thus reducing staff time. Then finally, as I said before, careful planning will help provide opportunities to make this process a little bit more streamlined, and we can also integrate new systems to help reduce risks. We had several systems involved in this one process, so there are opportunities to improve there as well. And with that, Mr. Chair, members of the committee, we would open it up for any questions.
Any questions, comments? Councilmember Martin?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for this, and I'm glad to see that we're going to centralize some of this. That's a little troubling, some of what you said. I'm concerned specifically about the conflict of interest part. What is our, I mean, it's great to put, I'm glad we're going to put a policy in place, but is there a plan to follow up, have a follow-up training for people who are working with the vendor systems? Because to me, especially as a public entity, that's very important.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Barber, I believe so. I would speak to the Assistant Director of Procurement. Are we looking for doing some training here? Potentially, if you'd like to come up. But, yes, and I know that you are also working on the conflict of interest procedure as well.
Yeah, thank you, Chair and committee members. I'm Laura Vetter, Assistant Director of the Council's Procurement Department, filling in here today for our director who's out of town. So to respond specifically to the question about the procedure, We have updated our conflicts of interest procedure recently that just went through the council's policy and procedure review team and has been approved. So we're now able to train on the updated procedure and introduce and clarify some of the points around conflict of interest. We also in procurement recently updated our solicitation documents to include a additional conflict of interest check. So this area would cover, so we have two types of conflicts when we check in our solicitations. There's organizational conflict, and there's also what we call personal financial conflict. And so now we are updated our forms to check for both of those conflicts. We've trained our own procurement staff on this, and we also do plan on developing a training more council-wide.
Thank you.
And Mr. Chair, members of the committee, it is one of our recommendations is to implement that, and currently the timetable is for by the end of quarter 1, 2023.
Are there any other questions? Member Jorgensen?
Thank you, Shirley. Thanks for the audit. I think this is a really important area, especially with the vendor file. I think especially when you look at the information here about, the audit logs and making sure that changes to the vendor file are done appropriately and that you know that they're legitimate. It's an area that's really easy to overlook, but it can be really, really important. And probably everybody here knows that governments are being subjected more and more to this type of fraud where somebody will call up and say, hey, let's change this name and this bank account number, and all of a sudden the payments that are supposed to be going to a legitimate vendor, they're going to the legitimate vendor but to a whole different bank account or something like that. And so I'm happy to see that you put that in there, and I think it's really important for those changes to be rock solid and consistently applied, because it's no fun to start getting involved with the FBI when it comes to trying to recover payments. So thank you for doing that work, and I hope that you're able to get something that's really solid for these types of procedures.
Member Galswick?
Yeah, thank you, Shirley. So I want to clarify, looking at this, I saw there's a number of comments on efficiencies and consistent process. So are we continuing to maintain 3 separate vendor files, or is there any appetite for consolidating those vendor files? And if there isn't an appetite, what is precluding us from merging those?
Mr. Chair, members of the committee member Galswick, I see the audit director is looking at somebody, I don't know if you're calling it someone else, but there, I believe, is an appetite. So part, that last comment there on the conclusions was we had multiple systems where each of the departments involved risk, HRA, and procurement. There is, I want to say, 5 different systems involved in this process. And so all of it ends up touching a singular system, not to get too much into it, but there are opportunities to consolidate there. And I believe there is an appetite, but I'm looking now to the deputy CFO, if she would like to come up and have that discussion.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and committee members. I am Maria Henderson, Deputy CFO. Yes, there's an absolute huge appetite to consolidate. We have a big system in EPSI. Perry can help me with the terminology. Right now, just to be very clear, we have all of the vendors entering into PeopleSoft, but then we have feeder systems. Like, for example, HRA goes into Housing Pro, we call that Happy system. HRA goes then into their Origami system, and procurement then stays. Actually, it doesn't, it goes into TXBase and WAM, which are 2 different PO systems. So we have a large appetite with our systems to get integrated. And for vendor setup, these are in each separate area now, following different procedures for their own particular needs.
Okay, so
Go ahead.
So to clarify, is there a single vendor file then, and then there's feeder systems that are pulling off that with additional information? And then also added to that clarification, what is considered the source of truth in our individual units then going to their subsidiary applications, or is it going back to PeopleSoft?
Okay, so Mr. Chair and committee member, single source of truth is PeopleSoft. And
Okay.
I can pull off any report for all of our vendors at any
Okay,
time. and have all of our vendors. What feeds into TX Base and WHAM and Origami and Happy, that's where we have differences of how does those systems pull that data, or if someone has entered in directly into TX Base and used a different, avenue versus spelling it out.
Got it. So it's if they were using those individual subsidiary systems instead of the central, they should be using the central.
That's correct.
Okay, that gives you some comfort. I was misunderstanding that. Thank you.
Are there any other questions or comments? All right, thank you, everyone. Next, we have a presentation on user administration by Kevin Healy and Teng Lo.
Hey, Chair Lee, members of the committee, thank you. I'm Kevin Ely. I facilitated the user administration audit as the auditor in charge. So a little bit of background. I think maybe the background is we all know user administration is the process by which you would add, change, or terminate user access within a system. And so as a part of our review of user administration, we actually incorporated some recent audit work by the Office of the State Auditor. So the State Auditor's Office has had findings for a number of years regarding the termination of employees and the untimely revocation of access to systems. So we kind of have a little bit of both going on in this audit. The OSA had a corrective action plan from 2019 that regarded the implementation of updates to the separation of employees procedure. And then we also had some work in 2020 with the second corrective action plan that was with respect to the leaving service form, so the form that we use to terminate employees and auditing of the use of the form, etc. All of the corrective action plans were really geared towards increasing the accountability for terminating employees and disabling access. So some scope and limitation notes. We actually had an audit scope that included all of the activities pertinent to user administration. Examined user administration activities for about a 2-year cycle from January of 2020 through December of 2021. We did experience limitations. One was a lack of documentation in the form of policies and procedures or constructions and job aids. Additional limitations existed with documentation of forms, network activity, and log data. We often found retention schedules for certain activities or logs were not exactly set up for audit. So we did have that limitation as well. So basically our objectives really were to evaluate the policies, procedures, and tools that were used for user administration. Looked at best practices from NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, as well as the Center for Internet Studies. Our implementation of policies and processes by HR for timely termination of employees. We did have an HR process component. We also looked at the implementation of procedures and processes by IS for disabling accounts. And then we also looked at the implementation of the corrective action plans. Observations were, first observation was that council policies and procedures for identity and credential management are not informed by industry standards and best practices. So the real risk here is that by not following effective technology security standards, we end up basically increasing the risk that employees could gain unauthorized access and damage council systems or data. Second observation, the council has not implemented role-based access controls. So the systems in scope for this were PeopleSoft Financials, PeopleSoft HRMS, Active Directory, and then also we had Office 365 as sort of the overarching. There's some cloud components that were also included with the AD reviews. So of course, without periodically reviewing the roles that are assigned to employees, the council may allow access to systems or data that could compromise the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of council systems and data. So at the more granular level, we looked and saw managers and HR staff processed a large number of late terminations, which complicates the council's user identity management. So when we're looking at the 2-year cycle, there were approximately 143 of 964 employee records that were terminated late. Here we say employee records because some employees held multiple jobs at the council, so you want to make sure that every job for a distinct employee is terminated. Of course, without a policy or procedure that requires a timely termination, you do risk that rogue employees may gain access to systems or assets and interrupt council services or systems. And then the last observation, managers and IS staff have not consistently terminated network user accounts in a timely fashion. So the access of network access was sort of a second step in the process. We did try to triangulate the number of times that network access was terminated. So we looked at both the submission of a network access request form to terminate access. We looked at service requests, so there should be a service ticket that was created for every network access termination. We also tried to look at log data, just to look at Active Directory log data for terminations and see if we could confirm by a log that the termination actually occurred. There were log data retention issues. We didn't have the retention schedule set up for log data. And then there were forms that were either not documented or submitted. So we went with service tickets, and we were able to find that there were 883 service tickets that were submitted to terminate approximately 948 individuals from January of 2020 through December of 2021. So generally, management agreed with our observations and recommendations, and we'll move maybe just on to questions, if there are any questions.
Questions, comments for Kevin? Yep, can we run the budget?
Yeah, so first comment then the question. So I see that there's quite long timelines for remediation on these issues. And after spending a large portion of my career tilting at these windmills of identity and access management, I understand how difficult this is, especially when you have many, many systems. So for those who don't work in this space, I just wanted to say that. The question I have, and this might get into territory where we shouldn't discuss in a public meeting, I'm probably talking to you or Craig offline about it. But I'm wondering about the automated control for disabling access, and what does that effectively prevent individuals from getting access to? I mean, is it essentially all of our systems? Is it only, kind of our enterprise PeopleSoft, those types of systems? So in other words, I know that that's us essentially relying on the safety net catch of we automatically disable something after X number of days, but how much comfort can we take from that?
Yeah, Chair Lee, Committee Member Galswick. And the short version, I think you could tell from the management response that we don't have an adequate inventory to ascertain the extent to which terminating network access would terminate access to all systems that the council owns. So we can't say with assurance. I might have to defer to Craig for a more detailed or nuanced review of that.
Yeah, well, thank you for the opportunity, Councilmember, Committee Member Goldswick. So there are, as you're well aware, there are kind of two components to identity and access management. One is the question of, is that system using a centralized password? In essence, this is called single sign-on. Does system A and B use the same password or authentication system, and thus turning it off in A also turns it off in B and C and so on. In terms of single sign-on, only a very small subset of our systems are using that. So that would be less than 10%.
Okay.
So that would be a first step to getting to where we want to be, which is ultimately role-based access control. So first you need to be able to have the same login credential for a system, and then you can manage the level of permission inside of each system based on what's appropriate needs of the role.
Yeah, go ahead.
So is there a situation though where you have to still VPN in or gain network access, and is that controlled by single sign-on, and does that help to reduce the number of applications that would have some protection?
Yes, absolutely. So our perimeter is protected by single sign-on or multi-factor authentication.
Okay, perfect, yeah, thank you.
Councilmember Bowman?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't quite know how to ask my question. So I see that the largest division percentage for late terminations was Metro Transit. Do they have the same login and access, like the procedures and steps that we had here? Because I know the different email addresses, and I just wasn't sure if is it something like a system that is kind of we're just
I can report significant progress in this direction recently. In the last few months, we've expanded access to the common login credential to nearly everyone at the council, increasing the volume of people by several thousand who have access to it. And that's a first step, is to get the account into someone's hand and then make it increasingly relevant by using it in more systems.
That helps. That's just with the legacy accounts of some of that, I can see where there could be two different kinds of things, so I'm glad to hear that.
Yes, we took the opportunity to do annual benefits enrollment to require the utilization of the new account.
Smart.
Any other questions or comments? I just have a comment. You know, the reports and business items that come before us are not always pretty when we look at ourselves and see the weaknesses we have to address, but that's why we have Matt and his team, and that's why we have this committee, so that we can course correct in the future and become a stronger organization. So I commend the work of all the staff involved in finding out all these issues that we need to address, so thank you.
Mr. Chair?
Yeah, go ahead, Councilwoman.
If I could just comment, I totally agree with what you just said, but I also want to thank those of you who are public members of this committee, because you bring so much background. And Committee Member Gulsvik, I really appreciate what you just said, because when I read some of this material in preparation for the meeting and then heard the presentation today, my stomach was in knots. And it helps to hear that this is a very difficult area, because I don't have a basis with which to compare this. So I'm glad to hear what you said, and glad to hear we're making progress.
Any other comments or questions? All right, thank you, Kevin. With that, we will go on to our information item, right?
Yes. So, Chair Lee, members of the committee, so I'm gonna pinch hit for Phil Walljasper on this one. Because Phil he called yesterday and said he could not speak for 5 minutes without losing his voice, and I think that continued today. So, I think what I'll do is give a very brief overview of what this project is, and we'll save some time for the next meeting to revisit and go into more detail. I think we should know more by that point, but on the whole, last year, Phil's position was elevated to incorporate enterprise risk management into his role. He's now the enterprise risk officer. To be more of a classic risk management department than just what it used to be, which is more focused on claims, workers' comp, insurance, things like that. So Phil is one of the first sort of initiatives within that role will be a contract project with Aon, who is going to come in and do, and I'm just going to read from he can discuss this in more detail, but the project will entail 2 phases. The first will be to develop a risk maturity index, so benchmarking the council's risk management principles and practices against global industry and peer companies, presumably some other public entities. And the second phase will be risk identification and assessment, so surveys and workshops to develop a risk register and prioritize risks within an operations business. And thinking about things like key risks against strategic goals and objectives, and identify and recommend key risk indicators for ongoing monitoring. The project is really just the beginning, so I don't want to oversell this as this is the project that's going to solve everything at the council. The idea is to get us started, develop a risk register. Phil and I have been working pretty closely on this project because of the importance of having audit and risk at the table together. I mean, as you've heard me talk about risk and how audits really dovetail with risk management, and should provide the council a better, as I discussed earlier, that sense of when we have an audit finding and we can assess what the risk is, the risk tolerance of the council, it'll create for better audits, it'll create for a better decision making at the council. I think it's worth just pointing out as council members are fully aware of the policy change that was made last month to incorporate risk management, better risk management practices in terms of transit decisions. I guess the 2 things that we're still in process of figuring out is, one, internally, who's on the risk management and how do we make decisions internally in terms of identifying risk, who's part of that discussion. Phil and I talked about that our model run incident command was actually a fairly successful one in terms of cutting across divisions. And so there might be some lessons learned from that model and the sort of level of individuals that were part of that effort that might be instructive here. Not exactly the same model, but something like that could work pretty well. And then the other thing is thinking about how the council members are engaged with enterprise risk management. So we certainly envision this committee to be a stakeholder. I think this is a good place for risk management discussions to happen. But it's obviously it's not just, as I just said, with transitways, it's going to be transportation committee, it's going to be environment committee, it's going to be management committee. So equity advisory committee even. So I think a lot more to come here, but I have to say this is really a badly needed effort at the council and something that will better position us moving forward with a lot of the challenges that we have. As I discussed earlier with the risk environment, they're just always there. And it's important to be aware of what your risks are and with always having a plan to address and move forward and mitigate rather than always feeling like you're reactive to things that you can see coming. So certainly look forward to having more discussions about this, but I know Phil thought it was important to at least get it out in the ether that we're doing this project and that we'll be hearing more about this in the coming weeks and months. So all right, any questions on this one?
The final information item is the next scheduled audit committee meeting. Did you have a date or what?
Likely February
Yeah,
or
Mr. Chair,
April.
typically we have a meeting in February to coordinate with the state audit entrance conference initial meeting. I think there'll be a little bit of navigating council member appointments, committee member appointments. So we'll try to time that either before or after all that happens. I think we're gonna kind of be passengers along with that process. So we'll get back to committee members if that's all right. But expect probably a February meeting to be the next one.
Okay. The only other thing I have is I was gonna indulge in a point of personal privilege. I know Marcy just left the room, but I wanted to recognize that she's retiring and she's been with us for 35 years. And as a policymaker, I just sit up here and vote yes or no and debate with my big mouth. But we know that the important work that moves us forward every day is the amazing work of the staff. And so I commend her and all the staff that work hard every day to keep us moving as an organization. And it just blows my mind that someone could dedicate their whole life's work to our organization. So I just, in particular, commend her, but in general, I want to thank all the staff for all your work every day. And with that, I adjourn this meeting.